Today, 22nd May 2024, I'm going to return in my discussions principally to the events in Ukraine, though I'm also going to touch on briefly some of the reactions in the United States to the decision that the Hague Court has made in issuing arrest warrants against top Israeli officials. But I'm going to talk about that later in the program. Let's first of all start with the situation in Ukraine, because it is clear to me that we are now very close to a turning point. And the first thing I'm going to say is that there's been more reports this morning of further Russian advances, and the Russian Ministry of Defense, just moments before I started making this program, announced that the village of Kleshcheevka, southwest of Bakhmut, has been captured by the Russian military, completely cleared by the Russian military, and that the Russians are once again firmly in control of Kleshcheevka. Now, Kleshcheevka in itself cannot be described as an important place. It's apparently a small village, apparently about 500 people before the conflict started. It's located to the southwest of Bakhmut, the big town in the area, which was captured by the Wagner forces last year in the fighting that took place in literally a year ago in May 2023. The Wagner forces completed their capture of Bakhmut. At that time, Kleshcheevka was under Russian control. It was one of the villages that the Wagner organization captured in its operations around Bakhmut. But then, in the weeks that followed, after the Wagner forces pulled out, Ukraine began its major counteroffensive. That counteroffensive was focused principally, well, at least most of the attention was focused on the Ukrainian, on the part of the Ukrainian counteroffensive that was focused on Zaporozhye, on trying to capture the town of Tokmak and then Melitopol and breaking through to the Black Sea, to the Sea of Azov. And there was also another secondary advance by the Ukrainians in the Remivka salient area, intended apparently to lead to an advance towards Mariupol. And of course, that offensive, the offensive in the south, failed disastrously. But what most people don't realize is that another big part of Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive took place in precisely this area, the Bakhmut area, and it was concentrated very much on capturing Kleshcheevka and Andreevka, two villages to the southwest of Bakhmut, and ultimately the plan appears to have been, is apparently General Syrski's plan, to advance from Kleshcheevka, capture the much bigger, more important village of Kurdyumovka, which is perhaps better understood as a suburb of Bakhmut, an industrial suburb of Bakhmut. And once Kurdyumovka had been captured, the idea was that the supply lines to Bakhmut from the east, from the Russian-controlled territory, from places like Popasnaya, could be cut off. And the idea was that this would open the way for Ukraine either to recapture Bakhmut itself, or perhaps to capture the western part of Bakhmut, the part that lies west of the Bakhmutsky River, which bisects Bakhmut. A massively ambitious, in fact, over-ambitious plan, which is also connected, by the way, to Ukrainian attacks to outflank Bakhmut from the north. The losses Ukraine suffered over the course of the summer of 2023 in trying to achieve this ambitious goal of recapturing Bakhmut were horrendous. The US was unhappy about this whole operation, but that didn't prevent General Syrski and President Zelensky from persisting with it. And it was this operation that resulted in the Ukraine's various attempts to capture Kleshcheevka, and it was the reason why Kleshcheevka slipped out of Russian control. My understanding is that the Ukrainian troops have been occupying parts of Kleshcheevka ever since, they've never really managed to fully consolidate control of Kleshcheevka, though they did capture the hills around and were able to keep the Russians at bay as a result. Well, the Russians are now back. They're in full control of Kleshcheevka once more. And there are reports that the entire Ukrainian defense lines in this area have now completely and irretrievably collapsed. And in this whole area, not just Kleshcheevka, but Andreevka also, and in the fields to the west of Kleshcheevka and Andreevka, there has been a general Ukrainian retreat. All Ukrainian forces in this area have now been pulled back and have been withdrawn west of the Seversky Donets Canal. So this whole area, quite a sizable area, by the way, we're talking about several tens of square kilometers of territory, is apparently about to fall under Russian control. Now, clinging on to Kleshcheevka in this kind of way made absolutely no sense to me. As is obvious, General Syrski's grand offensive in the Bakhmut area in the summer of last year achieved nothing, except it lost tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives, at least according to the Russians. It achieved nothing. It was a complete failure. It has made no sense to cling on to Kleshcheevka since the failure of that offensive and since the Russians went back onto the attack in this area. It was obvious to me that Ivanivska, a village to the northwest of Kleshcheevka, one which the Russians did not capture last year, the Wagner forces failed to capture Ivanivska. They made attempts to do so, but they never achieved it. Anyway, once Ivanivska fell and came under Russian control, it was only a matter of time before the Russians would capture Kleshcheevka as well, and Andreevka too, and it would have made far more sense, in my opinion, and would have saved many lives, Ukrainian and, by the way, Russian, if the Ukrainians had instead withdrawn to the west of the Seversky Donets Canal, had husbanded their forces in that way. And of course, the right thing to have done ever since the Ukrainian offensive in this area failed, and it was clear that it had failed by the autumn of 2023, the right thing to have done anyway was to create fortified lines along the Seversky Donets Canal, but as we now know, that was never done. So again, we see Ukraine investing huge amounts of men and resources, defending undefendable territory, failing to build fortifications where they might have been useful, and now as a result, facing the prospect of the Russians reaching the Seversky Donets Canal in this area also, occupying large amount of territory, and the Ukrainians having again lost many of the best troops fighting in Kleshcheevka and Andreevka to no useful purpose. This has been the consistent pattern of the war ever since it began, but we're now seeing increasingly the cost, the price that Ukraine is paying for these ill-conceived, in fact, disastrous tactics. Now, in terms of the immediate consequences of this imminent Russian advance in this southern area to the Seversky Donetsk Canal. What it means, in effect, is that the Russians are now well positioned across a large area of the canal. They can cross it in many places. As I said, there are several locations, apparently, where the canal goes underground into tunnels, so armored vehicles can cross without difficulty. The Ukrainians might be able, to some extent, to control the choke points, these tunnel areas. But with the Russians now occupying such a wide extent of the canal, it is only a question of time before they start moving across the canal, positioning themselves, not just, by the way, to attack Chasov Yar from the south, so doubtless that is what they're going to do, but to undertake further advances, perhaps turning southwards, joining up with Russian forces, moving northwards from Avdiivka, further to the south. We shall see. So, overall, a disaster for the Ukrainians, and one, by the way, which comes 2 days after the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that the other important village, this time in the Siversk area, not far, by the way, not so far from Chasov Yar, the fighting in Chasov Yar and the fighting in the area of Siversk are all closely connected to each other. It's just about an hour's distance by car from one part of the battlefield, from the Chasov Yar battlefield, to the southern points of the Siversk battlefield. Anyway, in the Siversk area, another important village, Belogorovka. The Russians have also captured it. They announced that 2 days ago. They're now apparently begun a major shelling and bombing attacks of Siversk itself. There's pictures circulating of what the Russians claim to be the military headquarters that the Ukrainians had established in Siversk being bombed and destroyed by the Russian Air Force, or perhaps in a missile strike. Anyway, the Russians have captured Belogorovka. They're likely to start an advance on Siversk from multiple directions here as well. Between Siversk and Chasov Yar, there are also reports some days ago that they're now moving towards capturing another village, Orekhovo-Vasilyevka, which puts them close to Kramatorsk. One way or the other, the fighting in this whole area is now intensifying, with the Russians advancing and capturing increasingly important locations. And in Chasov Yar itself, where a mighty battle with probably appalling casualties is now taking place, well, there's been now more confirmation that the Russians do in fact control a significant part of the micro-district. Reports that the Ukrainians had driven them out of the micro-district, which was circulating some days ago, appear to be conclusively wrong. The Russians seem to be increasing control of the micro-district. And there's also reports that even as Kleshcheevka has fallen and Ukrainian defenses south of Chasov Yar have collapsed, that the Russians have made more progress in the north, that there's reports that they're now clearing the village of Kalinina, north of Chasov Yar. Probably true. I don't know that for a fact, but it seems to me entirely likely that the Russians are clearing this particular village, and that if so, then that puts them in a strong position to advance on Chasov Yar by crossing the canal from the north as well. So likely before long that we're going to see multiple attacks on Chasov Yar. I suspect that once the micro-district is captured by the Russians, which now looks like only a matter of time, with apparently many of the best troops sent to defend Chasov Yar, Ukrainian troops sent to defend Chasov Yar, being lost when the defenses in the micro-district finally collapse. Well, when that happens, the Russians will be on the canal, right at the center of Chasov Yar, and of course they'll be located now in positions where they can cross the canal to the south and to the north of Chasov Yar as well. It's inevitable that there's going to be an attack on Chasov Yar from multiple directions, and it is likely, in fact it's, I would say, all but certain, that thereafter resistance in Chasov Yar is going to collapse, and then we're told that the Russians will have little difficulty in taking the rather larger place of Konstantinovka, which lies to the southwest of Chasov Yar, on low ground. Chasov Yar looks down towards it, and then Kleshcheevka, another small town, would also be likely to fall. If Kleshcheevka falls, the Russians are at the gates of Kramatorsk, the big city in the area which the Ukrainians have to control, because if they lose it, then they have lost control of Donbass. And I should say that I understand that the headquarters of Ukraine's group of forces that is defending Donbass, to my understanding, it is actually located in Kramatorsk. So we can see how this battle is playing out. And as I said, Siversk likely to come under attack before long. When that happens, the Russians strongly located also to advance towards Slovyansk, the town to the north of Kramatorsk, forming the northern spur of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation. Now, just to make one small point, this is, if you like, a slightly academic one now. I have learnt that this village of Kalinina, which is now being fought over to the north of Chasov Yar, is named after the former Soviet politician Mikhail Kalinin, who was actually the nominal president of the Soviet Union during most of the time of the rule of Joseph Stalin. The fact that this village has apparently chosen to retain the name of this particular Soviet politician, again, perhaps gives us a certain clue as to the political loyalties of many of the people in this area. Anyway, I will move on from that topic. So, dramatic news in the Chasov Yar area. An intense, terrible battle going on here. But again, it seems to me that though it's probably got many weeks still before it runs its course, the direction of this battle is now clear, and there is no option which I can see that Ukraine has to reverse what is happening in this direction. They can try and defend Chasov Yar, and Chasov Yar, unlike some of these other places we've been talking about, does actually have a significant strategic significance. But though they can defend it, it's all but impossible to see how they can prevent its eventual fall. Anyway, bad news in Chasov Yar. We've had less news over the last couple of hours about what's happening in the Kharkiv area, but there has been some news. It seems that the Russians are still making, or at least they claim that they're making, incremental progress in the Lipsy area, in the village of Lipsy. But it also seems that having consolidated control of Volchansk north of the Volcha River, they're now gradually consolidating their positions to the east and west of Volchansk, south of the Volcha River, where they have crossed, and we can probably expect over the next couple of hours a major Russian advance into Volchansk itself. Now, again, Volchansk, perhaps in some respects the most strategically important place, if you are somebody who spends time looking at maps. Lipsy only leads to Kharkiv. Volchansk, its fall would have resonance on battles further south in the Kupiansk area. And of course, the Russians have been on the advance in the Kupiansk area as well, not specifically towards Kupiansk itself, but as I've been discussing, they've clearly been on the attack, advancing towards various villages, attacking, storming various villages in the area south of Kupiansk, between their positions, the Russians' positions, and the Oskol and Zherebets river lines. And it's clear, again, that the Russian plan is to clear all the territory south of Kupiansk, all the way eventually to the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. And if all of that happens in conjunction eventually with the capture of Siversk, I mean, we're talking about events which will not happen immediately, but which will play out over several weeks, perhaps months. But anyway, if all of this happens, then just as the situation with the fall of Chasov Yar would look critical for the Ukrainians defending Kramatorsk, the southern spur of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation. So it will become very difficult indeed for the Ukrainians in the northern spur in Slavyansk. They could be facing attacks from the east, from the Liman area, from the Siversk-Liman area, but also potentially from the north, from the Kupiansk-Izium area, if the Russians do indeed, following the fall of Volchansk and the fall of Siversk, focus on recapturing these other territories also. So we can see the general pattern. As I said, it's important not to try to second guess the Russian General Staff too much, but Putin and Shoigu have both told us that there is a plan, that the General Staff is working, the Russian General Staff is working to a plan, and we can see how it is playing out on the battlefronts in northern Donbass and in Kharkiv region. Now, there is, of course, the wild card. A top Ukrainian official yesterday said that the Russian offensive in the Sumy area could begin at any time. The Ukrainians again have been rushing what reserves they have left to try to hold the Sumy area. There are reports that Abrams tanks and Bradley vehicles have appeared in this area, which suggests that the tormented 47th Mechanized Brigade, the Fire Brigade of the Ukrainian army, the one that's constantly been sent to hold positions in various parts of the front lines, that either it has been redeployed in full to the Sumy area, or perhaps more plausibly, that bits and bobs have been separated from it. I say that because just a couple of days ago, the 47th Mechanized Brigade was still clearly in the Avdiivka Ocheretino area, and they even attempted a brief counterattack towards the village of Solovyova from Sokol, village of Solovyova south of Ocheretino, an attack which, by the way, failed. But anyway, it looks as if either that entire brigade has been hurriedly dispatched to Sumy region to try to plug whatever gaps might arise there, or perhaps more plausibly, the Ukrainians, lacking reserves, are now detaching units, perhaps a battalion and some of its tanks, and are rushing them north to try to hold the positions in Sumy region in advance of when the Russian attack comes. Whatever, this brigade, the 47th Mechanized Brigade, has been involved in continuous fighting now for almost the entirety of the year since the 7th of June 2023. It must be exhausted. It's experienced multiple changes of command. It's seen its most senior NCO disgraced. It's suffered hideous losses in all sorts of places. It's been defeated in the Rabotino area and suffered heavy losses there. It's been defeated in the Avdiivka area. It lost Berdichi and Stepovoye and suffered very, very heavy losses there. It's been on the retreat in place after place, and now apparently it's being asked to do the impossible, again, to hold back the Russians in Sumy region. Well, we'll see what happens, but we can see how the Russian policy of stretching the Ukrainian defense lines is working and how well it's working in every part of the front lines. And to return now to what is happening in the Avdiivka Ocheretino area, well, in the very same area where the Ukrainians, where the 47th Mechanized Brigade began its unsuccessful counterattack towards Solovyova. We're getting reports that the Russians have advanced, that they're now approaching the village of Sokol. We now have conclusive video and photographic evidence that they have entered the village of Novo-Alexandrovka to the northwest of Ocheretino. Fighting, of course, continues to happen there, but apparently Ukrainian defenses again are becoming threadbare and may have difficulty holding positions, and the Russians advancing. Apparently now they're making progress, gradually taking control of the fields to the east of Ocheretino as well, gaining positions along the H20 highway and advancing towards Kalinova, another village to the north of Ocheretino, which it does seem as if eventually the Russians intend to capture. And also in the Avdiivka area, I said, I think it was yesterday or the day before, that there's evidence that Netalevo has fallen. We now have more confirmation of this. Apparently lots of pictures have appeared that the Russians not only control the built-up area of Netalevo, but also the various dacha communities around it, a fact which will have further significance on the still ongoing fighting in Krasnogorovka, further south. But it looks like the Russians have not only consolidated control of Netalevo, but they're also in the process of, they're probably preparing an attack towards Yasnobrodovka, the only village the Ukrainians hold in this area also. It seems this entire defense line the Ukrainians hurriedly improvised in this area. The one that they improvised after the fall of Toninka, Orlovka, Berdichi, in their main defense line after the fall of Avdiivka. Anyway, this new defense line seems to be on the brink of collapse also. And of course, again, we don't know what the Russians ultimately plan to do, what the Russian General Staff's plan is, whether more Russian forces will move towards Pokrovsk, which is now starting to appear just over the horizon, over the in front of the advancing Russian troops. But also, it may also be the case, though, that, as I said, their major objective is the important town of Kurachovo, somewhat to the south, and I've explained in many programs the importance of Kurachovo and the likelihood that when Kurachovo falls, the position of Ukrainian forces further south in Vuglidar will become impossible. And yesterday I mentioned that the 79th Brigade, the Ukrainian 79th Brigade, another one of these unhappy Ukrainian brigades, forced to defend positions long after they become undefendable, suffering hideous losses in the process. It's now reporting that the situation in its area of control, Paraskovyevka, Konstantinovka, the two villages immediately west of Novomikhailivka, which the Russians captured about 2 weeks ago. Anyway, they're now basically confirming that the Russians control all the fields to the south of Konstantinovka, and that the Russians have entered Paraskovyevka, and the battle for these two villages is also, from the Ukrainian point of view, being lost. And last but not least, before I round off on this brief summary of the events on this very complex battlefront, it appears also that the Russians have now captured in the Vremivka salient area around half of the villages, of the two villages of Staromayorsk and Urozhaine, that they control roughly half of these two villages. Again, I'm not clear why the Ukrainians are defending these two villages so intensely. It looks again to be very much an unwillingness to acknowledge the complete failure of their offensive of last year and the fact that all the gains that they achieved over the course of that offensive are proving ephemeral. But whatever, it looks as if the Russians are well on the way to capturing both of these villages. And of course, every day the Russians launch their missile and drone attacks across Ukraine. I mentioned the missile strike on Siversk, or bomb strike on Siversk, which led to the alleged destruction of the Ukrainian military headquarters in that particular town. So, a deteriorating situation, and one which it is important again to say is deteriorating right across the front lines in every part of this immense front line. The Ukrainians are on the retreat and the Russians are advancing. The territorial gains may not be huge, but more and more strategic locations are falling. Krasnogorovka, major battle going on there. Ukrainian troops there complaining that they are at risk of encirclement. Chasov Yar, well, we're somewhat behind there. Fighting there only began more recently, but a situation that is steadily moving towards crisis in Chasov Yar as well. Volchansk, also major crisis for Ukraine there too, the Russians expanding the hole in the defense lines that they established in Ocheretino, advancing both to the west towards Novo Alexandrovka and to the east, gaining control of positions along the H20 highway, threatening encirclement for the Ukrainian troops located west of Gorlovka, places like New York and Toretsk, and also perhaps threatening some role, some play in the battle of Chasov Yar, and looming battles starting to appear on the horizon, battles for Pokrovsk, Vuhledar, and the key towns of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. So a deteriorating situation, and one which is deteriorating rapidly every day. And as I said yesterday, The Economist tells us that Zelensky is yelling at his generals. He believes that he's not been told the truth about the situation. Anybody, by the way, who's had to work with somebody in authority who spends their time screaming and yelling knows how difficult it is to tell such a person the truth. Just saying. But anyway, that it violates all the rules of sound management, especially sound battlefield management. I would have thought, there again, I'm not familiar with the art of command. I doubt that Zelensky is either. But anyway, Zelensky getting more and more angry, more and more desperate, taking out much of his anger against his own generals, but still giving orders that look increasingly irrational and which basically have the appearance to me now not so much of Zelensky trying to retain every millimeter of territory in order to impress the United States, but rather of Zelensky trying to hold on to every millimeter of territory in order to keep the Russians as far as possible from Kiev and ultimately from himself. Just saying. Anyway, there we go. A very complex situation on the battlefronts. But it is not just on the battlefronts that things are playing out very badly. Now, I have spoken in several programs about how all of Ukraine's cities, I've not had reports from Kiev about this, but all of the other Ukrainian cities appear to have become ghost towns, deserted cities. The enactment into law of mobilization appears to have resulted in the men hiding in their homes, afraid to come out and work, afraid that if they do come out, the press gangs, which is what many of these Ukrainian recruiters basically are, will seize them and will throw them into the army and will throw them from the army straight into the battlefronts. And I mentioned that one of the Ukrainian Telegram channels, I believe it was Legitimi, said that the present strategy, if it can be called that, of the Ukrainian leadership is to pull in as many men as possible, as quickly, give them perfunctory training and throw them into the battle as soon as possible in order to try to keep the Russians at bay for as long as possible. And I've heard reports, everybody who tracks this war closely is reading these desperately sad reports of Ukrainian soldiers, of Ukrainian men being sent into battle, sometimes with just a few days training, when, of course, they have no idea of how to conduct themselves in the terrifying landscape of a battlefield where the Russians have overwhelming preponderance in artillery, where their drones fill the skies, and where the Russian Air Force operates all the time, and where the Russian infantry and armored forces are also increasingly well equipped and experienced in battle, and therefore and therefore increasingly effective. And supposedly, men who have been called up and thrown into battle in this way are dying in terrible numbers, probably losses even greater than those we've been hearing about and which the Russian Defense Ministry is maybe reporting. But anyway, a terrible situation. And as I say, we see pictures now of these deserted cities. Now, this is not a sustainable situation. Sooner or later, the men have to come out. Presumably, they are the breadwinners for their families. Some of them are, at least. They have to go out and work. The fact that they are not doing so at all at the moment is contributing to the ongoing collapse of Ukraine's economy. Now, Governor Kim of Nikolaev region, he has actually been an important personality on the Ukrainian side for some time. Anyway, Governor Kim is now talking about the desertion of the cities, the fact that the cities have emptied of men, that they're no longer visible, and he's expressed concerns about the effect that this will have on the Ukrainian economy. As I said, eventually the men are going to have to leave their homes. They have to work, they have to engage in some of the essential things that all of us must do as part of our lives. And one wonders exactly what is going to happen, politically and otherwise, when that takes place. But putting that aside, it's absolutely clear that across Ukraine, the population no longer wants to fight. They no longer want to continue the war. Back in 2022, when the Russians first entered Ukraine, the recruiting stations saw queues as Ukrainian men joined up to fight. I think it's now clear that that was the intensely patriotic, highly ideological demographic which had supported the Maidan revolution, if you can call it that, of 2014. That demographic has fought the war. It has, in many cases, fought with extreme bravery. It's often been badly and foolishly led, and it has essentially been destroyed. The remainder of the Ukrainian population, having sensed that the war is being lost, conscious of the fact that the losses on the battlefronts are on a horrific scale, and that the survival rate of Ukrainian infantry is now desperately low, and perhaps less enthusiastic about the change of regime that took place in 2014. It's clear that they don't want to fight. So, what happens if the men do come out and they are rounded up and they are sent, perhaps only with perfunctory training, to fill up the gaps in the army on the battlefronts. Losses will obviously be very high, but will the unwillingness of these men to fight, will that start to undermine the morale, further undermine the morale of the Ukrainian units on the battlefront, the brigades on the battlefront? We are already getting many reports that the morale is very low, lower than it has been at any point up to now in the war. Though, as I said, the brigades in general do still keep on fighting. They may receive orders that they consider irrational. The generals may be fuming at the fact that they get screaming and yelling fits from Zelensky, but they still overall continue to obey his orders and Syrski's orders despite the tantrums. Well, will that continue when these men do eventually join up and appear in the army? Those who have studied the events leading up to the Russian Revolution of 1917 will know that one of the causes of the revolution was the fact that over the course of the First World War, the Russian government engaged in a massive conscription, calling up hundreds of thousands, millions of men to fight, and that it ultimately diluted many of the original Russian regiments, including the Guards regiments that were located in the capital, and that it was the disaffection of many of these recently mobilized soldiers that was one of the factors which eventually led to the February crisis in 1917, which resulted ultimately in the collapse of the army and the fall of the Tsar and the end of the monarchy in Russia. Well, history never repeats itself, but it does sometimes rhyme. We'll see whether anything like that plays out again. Anyway, a hollowed out Ukraine, an army that is struggling to hold back this Russian flood, and this Russian flood is rising gradually but irresistibly. The Russians still conserving their forces, unwilling to embrace massive casualties. I mean, they could probably capture, for example, Krasnogorovka now, if they were to launch a sustained attack on Ukrainian positions in that town. But they're unwilling to do that. They still want to conserve their forces. So they work instead in this complicated way, cutting off the supply lines, bombing and shelling the Ukrainian forces in Krasnogorovka, taking their time to capture Krasnogorovka because they don't want to create problems, tensions within their own country by incurring the very heavy losses that outright attacks, frontal attacks on Ukrainian positions would incur, even if they might be successful. So it's a slowly rising tide, the Russian pressure growing all the time, and one wonders how long it will be before the Ukrainian army really does begin to break, when the cascade of collapse will come, and whether we are going to see at some point whole brigades not just disobeying orders, that of course has already happened, but actually deserting, surrendering en masse to the Russians. Probably the clearest sign when that begins to happen that the war, in effect, is lost. Now, to repeat a point I have made before, a key thing to understand about wars of attrition is that for a very long time, it can seem as if the situation, territorially speaking, is in stalemate. But when the collapse comes, it comes suddenly. And I suspect that that's going to be true about Ukraine also. I'm not going to predict the moment of that collapse, but that is the trajectory that we're seeing playing out. Now, what is Zelensky's strategy? What is the strategy of the Ukrainian political leadership faced with this gathering crisis? Well, I discussed it in a couple of programs a couple of programs ago. It is to try to get the West directly involved in the war. Now, Zelensky's officials, there's apparently a large delegation currently in the US. Apparently, they've been talking to the usual people in Congress. They're trying to get the United States to authorize Ukraine to launch missile strikes using American weapons on Russian positions in Russia itself. And already some members of Congress, completely predictably, have come along and have endorsed that. They're coming along and saying, let's go ahead and agree to these Ukrainian claims, demands for missile strikes, presumably with ATACMS missiles and whatever, deep inside Russia. It can only be ATACMS missiles because there is no other weapon system that Ukraine has that could launch attacks deep into Russia. Ukraine has HIMARS missiles, which can be launched from the HIMARS launchers, and small diameter bombs, which can also be launched from HIMARS launchers. Though these have only limited range, they can reach Belgorod, but they can't reach positions much further than that. ATACMS missiles, in theory, if they were launched from somewhere like Kharkiv, say, probably could would be able to reach much more deeply into Russia itself. Now, having said that, it's important to say that these missile strikes with ATACMS missiles and all of the rest cannot change the outcome of the war. I suspect also that these Ukrainian demands for these missile strikes towards Russia itself are possibly, to some extent, caused by disappointment at the failure of the ATACMS missiles in terms of the multiple strikes that Ukraine has undertaken using these missiles against Crimea. This has been a long-running story for several weeks now. I've discussed how the Russian air defense system seems to be coping reasonably successfully to the strikes, the attempted Ukrainian strikes using these ATACMS missiles. It seems that the Russians say that they've shot down scores of these missiles, and I believe that is correct. And so far, these missiles don't appear to have achieved very much. So it could be that Ukraine is despairing of the prospects of its missile strikes towards Crimea. It senses that the situation is becoming increasingly bad, that the Russians have the problem of the ATACMS missiles in Crimea relatively under control. So the time has come to launch missile strikes against other places in Russia as well. But ultimately, the objective is fairly straightforward. It is to involve the United States, even if ATACMS missiles launched from, say, Kharkiv or Sumy or some such place could hit targets deeper inside Russia. The Russian air defense system would probably be able to parry most of the blows, and given the gigantic size of Russia, by far the world's largest country, these strikes could only be pinpricks, however devastating the individual damage of some of these missiles might be. Now, to get a sense of this, let's dial back and recall another story which was widely talked about and promoted a few weeks ago. There was a major Ukrainian drone offensive against the Russian oil refineries. And there was a lot of talk because a number of refineries were attacked, and there were pictures of refinery fires, that these attacks, in combination with the difficulties supposedly the Russians would suffer from the sanctions in repairing these refineries, that this would cause major problems for the Russian oil and energy complex. And there were all kinds of reports about how the Biden administration disapproved of the attacks on these refineries because they were worried that these attacks by these Ukrainian drones on these refineries would cause enough damage to affect the global supply of oil and of oil products, and that this would then lead to a rise in fuel prices, which would be awkward for President Biden ahead of the election. I'm sure many people can remember all of those claims. And I expressed bafflement about them because, again, having a certain amount of experience in industrial matters, but none at all, I should say, in oil industry and energy matters, it seemed to me that this bore absolutely no relation to reality. The sheer scale of the Russian oil and energy complex, the sheer scale of some of these refineries, the small size of some of these drones, the effectiveness of the Russian air defense system meant that the amount of damage that these drones could do would be limited. And I thought the claims that the Russians would not be able to repair the damage done in a relatively short time to be frankly ridiculous. Well, just yesterday, I saw reports that in fact there is now a glut of refined fuels in Russia. The refineries have been largely repaired. They've also been hardened against drone attacks so that the damage done has been significantly reduced. And, well, one way or the other, there is now so much refined oil, diesel and petrol and all that sloshing around Russia that the Russian government has temporarily lifted restrictions on the export of refined oil products in order to clear the oversupply of refined fuels in Russia itself, and to some extent reduce stockpiles of these fuels in the refineries so that they can work more efficiently from this point going forward. And as I've also pointed out, and as various people in Russia have confirmed to me, there was never any sign that any of these attacks had led to any significant increase in the price of refined oils on the Russian market at all. So we see how that drone offensive ultimately failed, despite the way in which it was promoted. And, well, missile strikes using ATACMS missiles can certainly do an awful lot more damage than drones can. If an ATACMS missile smashes into a refinery, then it will do an awful lot more damage to a refinery than a small drone can possibly do. Though even then it might not be able to destroy the refinery entirely. That would, of course, depend on its size. But again, the amount of actual harm to an economy the size of Russia's, to a country the size of Russia's, that missile strikes from Ukraine could realistically do. I mean, it would have no military or economic significance. The one thing it would do, and I am sure the Ukrainians know this, is bring down Russia's wrath. The Russians have already given a very, very clear warning to the British against the British launching missile strikes, supporting or assisting Ukraine in launching missile strikes with British missiles against Russian territory. The Russians have reacted extremely strongly to that threat. There's no reason to think that they would react any less strongly if the United States became involved in this. The Russians said to the British that if British missiles were used in that way, the Russians would respond, and they would respond against military targets, British military targets, anywhere in the world, including implicitly Britain itself. I think anybody who thinks that the Russians will hold back from doing the same to the far more widely spread out US military really needs to avoid falling into complacency. The Ukrainians know that what they're trying to do, as they see the writing on the wall, as Zelensky himself sees the writing on the wall, what they're trying to do is to drag the United States into the war. That also explains their demand for trainers. President Zelensky has just given a long interview in which he complains that he's been hearing an awful lot about the trainers, but he hasn't actually seen any of them. What he really means is he wants US Special Forces troops fighting alongside his own in Ukraine. Again, not because he expects that that's going to make any difference in the war, because it won't, but because if American troops are fighting Russian troops in Ukraine, he hopes that that will lead, just as the South Vietnamese government sought all those years ago in the 1960s to achieve, it would lead to the deployment of US ground forces in Ukraine. Now, there is strong opposition to this in Europe. The German government has again, in effect, spoken out against this idea. The Italian defense minister, who seems to be under immense stress, but who has been repeatedly talking against this idea, and doing so, I am sure, with the support of the overwhelming support of the Italian public. Apparently he's been hospitalized. Nobody seems to know exactly what's wrong with him. I suspect that he is feeling the immense stress. With the Biden administration, however, in charge, one wonders exactly what will happen. General Brown, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who I suspect in private has been arguing against this idea, he said with a tone which seemed to me a resignation that sooner or later the deployment of the trainers was inevitable. In other words, the special forces to Ukraine was inevitable. one gets the sense that he feels that he's trying to hold back again the flood of demands, which is now coming from Congress. Members of Congress are also apparently supporting this reckless idea. Anyway, all of this is happening in the United States. The president himself shows all the signs of obsession over Ukraine. And I have to say, I think sooner or later, this green light to Ukraine will come. Only, again, I expect that it will be delayed until after the November election. I know that Stephen Bryan has come in for some stick for some of his articles recently, but I think that he is right in what he said, that after the election, if the present administration is re-elected, we are going to see more aggressive moves from the United States, even though those cannot change the outcome of the war. They can only create an even more dangerous situation than the one we have already seen. And Jeff Roberts, the British historian, to repeat again his point, that the major deterrent the Western powers face is that their armies in Europe are not strong enough in Ukraine to take on the Russians. The military knows it. Some people in the West seem unwilling to accept it, but there we are. And unfortunately, it is those who are unwilling to accept it who have, or who seem to be, for the moment, very much in control. Glenn Deason, another person, as I said, who known to me, he's actually pointed out in several places that with the prospect of Russian victory, military victory, now growing, we are perhaps entering the most dangerous period in the war so far. We had a major alarm 2 weeks ago when the Russians called in the British and French ambassadors. They gave them strong warnings then. That does seem to have shocked Western governments for a time. But as the Russian flood in Ukraine rises, we see some of these dangerous ideas coming back, and we see Zelensky pushing them, and we see that in the United States especially, they're finding some takers. This endless pattern of escalation can only lead, in the end, either to a bigger defeat, an even bigger defeat than the one we're looking at now, or eventually to an outright catastrophe. A catastrophe of unimaginable proportions, an outright World War III, which I do not want to discuss in this program. But in terms of defeat, all I would say is that if the West becomes involved fighting Russia in Ukraine, a Russian army, as I said, already stronger than the Western army, the West's armies, at least the armies in Europe, it's difficult to imagine that other powers might not eventually become involved. There's an article in the Financial Times today which says that the British expect that before long the Chinese will actually start to supply weapon systems, complete weapon systems, to the Russians. I don't think there is any such plan in Beijing or Moscow. I don't see why there would be. But to be clear, if Western armies go into Ukraine to fight, not only will they be outmatched by the Russians, but the possibility that they might find that the Chinese are involved as a weapon and ammunition supplier to the Russians also will, I think, exponentially increase. And to repeat again, the aggregate industrial and raw material resources of the Russians and the Chinese massively eclipse those of the West, and those who think otherwise are in denial about the realities. Well, we will see whether we come to that. But we have further examples of how utterly self-defeating Western policy on so many issues has now become. And we see this with the response of the United States to the decision of the chief prosecutor of the ICC to seek warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant of Israel. We're told that this has sparked universal anger across the entire political class in the United States. That, by the way, is not true. I understand Bernie Sanders and some other members of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party are supporting the ICC chief prosecutor. But never mind. All of the people who matter, the president and his team, the Democratic Party establishment, Chuck Schumer and all of those, and all of the Republicans, Mike Johnson, Mitch McConnell, presumably Donald Trump before long, they're all united in fiercely criticizing the ICC. There are reports, in fact, they're not reports, Secretary Blinken is apparently now in consultation in Congress about imposing sanctions on the ICC. Sanctions specifically targeted against the chief prosecutor of the ICC, Karim Khan, and other officials. Now, again, do the Americans understand what they are doing? First of all, they're in this situation because, as is, I think, fairly well known, I don't think it's disputed. In fact, I seem to recall reading about it in the British media some time ago. This whole situation arose because roughly a year ago, I forget exactly when, the Western governments lobbied the ICC to issue some kind of a warrant against Russia's President Putin. In doing so, they ignored the jurisdiction issue. They found a way around it by getting Ukraine to say that even though Ukraine is not a member of the Rome Statute, has not ratified the Rome Statute, nonetheless, it's prepared to enforce the Rome Statute on its territory, at least with respect to Russia, presumably not itself. Anyway, I'm not going to get into the details of that. But anyway, the jurisdictional issue was circumvented and a warrant was issued against President Putin and another Russian official. Warrants which, in my opinion, make absolutely no legal sense. But I'm not going to get into a discussion of those. And by the way, the ICC, I believe, has issued further warrants since then against various Russian military officials. Again, disregarding the issue of jurisdiction. Well, what applied to Russia, many countries around the world say should apply to Israel also. After all, alleged Israeli crimes are even more egregious and they've been carried out in full public view. We've had all of these extraordinary statements by Israeli officials. Israel, of course, has also not ratified the Rome Convention. But you can't really rely on that anymore because, after all, Palestine apparently has done so. And they say that all these events are taking place on their territory. And if Ukraine can say that jurisdiction applies because they've granted authority to apply the convention to the ICC for events on their territory, well, why can't Palestinians say the same thing about what's happening on their own territory. So it's the same set of arguments. Of course, there are other arguments too. The United States and others are seeking to deny that Palestine is a state at all, is in any way a state. Of course, they don't recognize Palestine as a state, but many countries around the world do. And there were reports this morning that some European countries, including importantly Spain and Ireland, are about to recognize the Palestinian state. They're going to take that initiative themselves. So I don't think that argument stacks up especially well. They also say that the Israeli judicial system should have been applied to first, but it seems acknowledged that that can only happen after the fighting in Gaza has ended. And that would mean, in effect, that the ICC would sit on its hands as the war goes on and as the alleged war crimes continue to be committed. And that is both a politically and, in my opinion, legally unsustainable position to take. But anyway, there we are. And of course, it's not one that they would certainly apply towards Russia and its legal system either. So anyway, there we are. That is what has happened. The case against Putin opened up the way, ultimately, for the ICC to enlarge its authority, to again circumvent the issue of jurisdiction, and under undoubted massive pressure from around the world, to issue the warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant. And so what does the United States do? Of course, they don't really want to discuss the contradictions in their stance, but they are now going to sanction Karim Khan and other ICC officials. Now, it's been pointed out that this has happened before. The Trump administration, for a certain time, sanctioned the ICC's then chief prosecutor, the predecessor to Karim Khan, and another senior official in the ICC. The Biden administration, when he came into office, cancelled those sanctions. But I would say this, I don't know anything about those two officials, but from what I understand, they come from countries in the global south, probably Africa. I think that sanctioning a British barrister, which is what Karim Khan is, a member of the British legal community, a King's Counsel, would be a far more dramatic act. It would certainly have a major impact within the political and legal establishment in Britain. And as I understand it, one of Karim Khan's brothers has been, or perhaps still is, a British Conservative MP. So this would be extending the practice of sanctions to someone who is an important figure in Britain, very much, as I said, someone who functions within the British establishment, and of course someone who did what the Americans and the British and the other Western powers wanted him to do when he sought and got the arrest warrant against President Putin. I don't think the US understands, firstly, the implications of doing that, and I don't think the US perhaps fully understands also the effect it's going to have around the world, how it will seem even more to more and more countries around the world that these steps the United States is taking suggest that the US wants the ICC to act only against American enemies, but will come down on it hard if it acts against American friends. Despite Karim Khan's painstaking statements, including verbal statements, filmed statements, in which he said that if law is not administered impartially, without bias or favor, then it is not law at all, and that the ICC cannot engage in selective prosecutions, or perhaps more accurately, cannot be seen to engage in selective prosecutions, only prosecuting people from some countries and not prosecuting people from other countries. Because if it did that, it would no longer be acting according to law. And though Karim Khan didn't say this, obviously its entire reputation would collapse. By going after the ICC in the way that it is doing, the United States is undermining the ICC. Perhaps it doesn't care about that, but it is also undermining the entire case, which was so painstakingly put together against President Putin a year or so ago. The Russians are hooting about this. They are enjoying the spectacle massively. The Russian Foreign Ministry has made a comment about how the United States and the West are behaving like a scorpion that is stinging itself with its own tail, and a spider that is caught in its own web. My opinion, the mistake was to disregard the issue of jurisdiction in the first place and to seek that warrant against President Putin, despite the jurisdictional issue. But that was the mistake they made. They created a precedent by doing that, and now they find themselves embarrassed by it. Truly, the spider has indeed been trapped by its own web. Well, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our video, our shop, and get yourself all the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.